All right, we're recording. This is April 21, and we've got lots to get through. This is really our most significant meeting before our planned release, I think on April 29 of v0.3.0. So really trying to get through a lot and focus on what we have planned for this milestone, what might make it, what needs a little bit of a nudge, and what will likely not make it. So I've added a bunch on the agenda related to that, but feel free as always to add anything else as well. I also wanted to point out that we've got a straw poll going on. I think everyone here, almost everyone here has already filled this out. If you haven't, please do. There's trends that are appearing on this straw poll for new meeting times. And for context, this was inspired as it was becoming clear that we really could benefit from a different meeting time. We had one meeting time that was pretty terrible for whether you were in Europe or Australia, as an example, and we happened to have people contributing from both of those places. And it's very hard to find a time that works for both of them. But we may want to consider going back to a pattern where we were rotating between times.
How did that work? Did people have who are on the call today? I know it's not everyone. Like, did that work out actually, or did people just end up attending both, and it was just on average, like okay? It's like the compromise is like to make it, I guess, like on average worse for everyone slightly.
Yeah, my perspective on that's a good point, is it makes it more confusing for everyone to rotate back and forth. It did, to a point, enable, I think we had more of an opportunity to get contributions from or a conversation with folks that otherwise wouldn't be able to attend the meeting. On the other hand, it does complicate things. Now that we do have significant contributions from different continents, shall we say, and different, significantly different time zones, it feels like it's worth exploring again. But I'll admit that it was not the easiest thing to do. It's challenging when you have when you kind of want to time the content for the attendees, this set of maintainers is really interested in this topic, so we really shouldn't discuss it this week. We should discuss it next week. But I don't think anyone has solved this problem of scheduling meetings across time zones. I don't know. Anyone else?
Okay, I was just curious to just hear if anyone had like very strong opinions or on it. I think we managed to make the flip-flop time zone thing work, and people didn't get confused and attend the wrong time. But yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think there's never going to be a good way. I've worked with Australia now for 3 or 4 years, and it's just never easy. Yeah. Someone always loses. When you're that far apart, it's just hard to make something work. Yeah. So, I don't know.
Yeah, you can see what's surprising to me. Like, we have 12 people who have responded so far, and I think there's a couple more that still need to. But the highest number I can find right now is 8, which is Mondays at 3 Pacific. And what you're seeing there is that a number of the people that can't meet there but they could meet, morning time, which is a more Europe friendly time. So you could see how you could potentially make morning and Europe and Australian times work reasonably well, but it's tough. I don't know. I think for now, I'll leave this open for another week, try and get a couple more responses here. But if anyone has strong opinions on this, we do have a pretty strong first choice, which is when most 2/3 of current respondents can meet. But if we could get even more than that, that would be awesome. So maybe that does involve going back to the rotating system. All right, and of course, if you haven't had a chance, please go ahead and vote on this. Link should be in the agenda. All right, the next thing I had on here was kind of an overarching topic that came up related to backend policy, what the future is, where it belongs, all of the above. And so timeouts, there was a good conversation in a Slack thread maybe yesterday, fairly recently, and also tried to surface some of the highlights from that on a GitHub issue, and there's been some follow-up conversation there as well. But what I had initially thought was a clear path to portability or a reasonable path for portability between timeouts really became more and more challenging as you start to dig into the nuance of what a specific timeout setting meant on each implementation. And there's what I've seen is significant variation. So as an example, let's say you split up your request into a bunch of different segments. Some implementations cover from B to E, where others cover from C to D. And, it's very difficult to find a consistent way to configure this that would truly be portable.
Well, Rob, I had a couple comments about that. So one is that is there one way to do it is to literally look at how it's implemented and say, the behavior has to be 100%. The other one is, so there's two things actually. One of them is there a generic one that we could implement that is reasonably easy to explain, that covers most of the user use cases? And then of course, if they have to dig into it, they have to get into how the implementation specifically does it. The other one is, is it the case that all of these are kind of separated out and it's not meaningful to have a bunch of knobs and then say, hey, if you're interested in the specifics, you can go and look at the specific implementations? For example, right, like in CSI, like let's say you have like a storage volume and it has particular, like failure semantic, like does that need to be specified, or is that mostly up to the implementation? Like, what is that? Where does the specification need to end? And if we end it at a fairly high level, does that change the question?
Yeah, I briefly explored, and I wrote out here the idea of a request or read timeout, which read timeout can either be similar to how a request timeout is defined in some implementations or entirely different depending on the implementation. But I highlighted some implementations that had some similarity here. So you can see that you could, if you squinted your eyes enough and tried to make things look similar, you could see some similarities between GCP, Envoy, Traffic, HA Proxy, Skipper. Like they have some concept of timeout that, if defined broadly enough, could be considered similar. So that was a path, but it does notably leave out implementations, and there are fairly significant deviations between what each of these timeouts mean. So if it's valuable to have just kind of a generic timeout concept, and each implementation can kind of map it to something similar to that, that's reasonable. What I think could get confusing is a number of implementations have, say, 3 or 4 different timeouts that they support, and those
right. But do we need to surface that? Like, what if
no?
What if like the user, because from the user standpoint, what if the portable thing is just like the easy button, and they just say, I want a timeout or I want some timeout. And then it's up to the implementation to kind of render it into a reasonable policy from their standpoint. But it's not necessarily the case that for the portable one, we need to basically say, you know, this timeout is for the fact that the write syscall didn't return
Sure.
in X, right? You get what I'm saying? Or like,
Yeah.
or the read syscall didn't come.
Yeah. So
Or
I guess
equal.
a follow-up question to that, would that make timeout here if we added it an implementation specific concept instead of a extended concept? Because I don't think I don't think it would be a portable concept per se.
So could we come up with a contract that is, the portable part would be, generically speaking, if you set a timeout and your requests, either the request didn't finish, like basically there's some general notion of a timeout in that HTTP especially, there's some request response at events, and that chain had a timed out, right? Like I'm assuming that is implementable everywhere. Now the specifics of like, did the packet or read syscall happen or write syscall, like that is what I consider to be like maybe something that's rendered from that more general notion.
Yeah, I mean, there's room for some concept of portability here if we define this very broadly and generically. I'm interested, yeah, Harry, anyone else feedback on this?
Yeah, we need to stick to a definition of portability that's consistent throughout the API, right? Like when we have talked about like matching semantics and routing, we have been prescriptive enough that they are at a fairly high level, but users will still expect things to work across implementation in a certain way, right? Like let's take a very simple example of path matching, right? That's become very portable. Even in like Ingress V1, we work to make it portable, as in like you take the spec and drop in across multiple implementations and it will work fine, and that provides some value to the end user. When we are thinking about portability here, we're trying to sort of do like, okay, take this and drop into a separate implementation, but now the semantics change. What I
Well,
question, and I don't really know, is it of value to the end user?
that's true. I think it's of value if we can describe it in like, this is a timeout for these HTTP or protocol level events. For example, request and response, like the timeout for that whole transaction. I think every implementation necessarily has to kind of been built to address that use case. And that would be the portable aspect of it. The nitty gritty in terms of like when a specific thing might fire, that one might have to be implementation specific. But the overall concept would still, I would hope, be a portable one. Like, let's say I'm coming to this and I don't necessarily care about the nitty gritty, but I do want to say that within 10 seconds, if this request response transaction didn't complete, then just give me a timeout, give me an error in some way. Like, how would that be possible? It might not be possible, but it just seems like that is something that is like a use case that people would be very natural for every system.
That is fair. I think users expecting that is completely fair, and it seems pretty intuitive. The reality is it's very hard, especially like going deep into Nginx. I don't think Nginx has any such thing. So just giving an example of Nginx. So I don't know how we go about.
Oh, I see an overall request response timeout. It only has the
per byte
Nginx
timeout or
something.
I listed a few examples here. Nginx is one caddy server. I think there's some other ones that have a variety of timeouts, and none of them are in any way mappable to this concept. So you could argue, okay, well, this is an extended feature, and
I mean, we could be clever about it. Like, let's say you have the timeout is that there has been no forward progress or something towards that transaction.
Right, but
I
that's
would go ahead, Rob.
well, yeah, that is a kind of timeout that is defined by a number of implementations, but that's different than a request timeout. And so you either have to like back out
Forward progress
really far,
towards the completion of the transaction.
right? But a
You get
request
what I'm
timeout
saying?
is
Like,
sure, but a request timeout is different than that. Like, you know, like that, what you're describing is more like an idle timeout, as I understand it, right?
no, the transaction is request response,
For
and
sure.
forward progress basically covers that entire thing. That means that if your request was received and then you don't get a response, that's part of the timeout. Also, if you're trying to
Right.
read, you're not making forward progress either.
Right, but
So
a
that's like a
request
generic
timeout,
notion.
a request timeout will trigger even if you're still getting a response. Like even if in some cases, you know, it's still being worked on, it's just taking longer, but the request timeout would still trigger. So you're still making forward progress, but these timeouts are going to trigger because the response isn't complete yet. Or depending on
I guess, like, yeah, I don't necessarily mean forward progress. What I mean is, like, for example, we could also say that the timeout is a conservative notion in that you basically render it into a form where, I guess the Nginx wouldn't. So Nginx, you could have like a stream, like an infinite object, and it would never time out.
I think it will.
Yeah, there are different timeouts in Nginx. That's part of the problem, and none of them really map to this. And Nginx isn't alone. There are other ones, and Nginx is just probably the most common example of a different approach here.
So the problem here is, as we have just, like, you know, like this discussion has demonstrated, timeouts are notoriously hard to even communicate, right? There is so much language to it. You know, one thing that means something to me means something else to somebody else. And if we try to, like, I think what we are trying to do is doing something good for the end user. But if we try to do an abstraction, we are just, I think, increasing the problem of confusions with timeouts in the industry, right? Like right now, everybody gets confused about it. And then, you know, we sort of, you know, like there's that XKCD where, you know, you have so many standards, time to write a new standard. And that's what we are doing here, is what I personally feel. Yeah, that's my thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's fair. I think, like, it would be good to document a common pattern. Maybe it's impossible to render in code or at the Go type level, is basically what we're saying.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That it's very difficult to, you know, looking across the common implementations here to find some kind of portable concept that can be translated to each of them. And if we can't do that, then it becomes difficult to see the value in adding it to the API. Because like Harry had mentioned, you end up in this place where you are either confusing users, like timeout means something different for each implementation, or other implementations are still going to have to provide their own way of specifying their own timeouts. So minimal value here.
Okay,
I don't know.
I think, like, it would be good to figure out how we can make this understandable, because people for sure are going to set timeouts. So, like,
yeah,
is there maybe like a implementers
So I mean that
guideline here
that's
then?
Yeah, I think people want to set timeouts, right? But again, users in most cases, right, not all cases, want to set timeout, at a global level. I think that's another issue that's going on around, like global policy or something like that. So if we can somehow separate out this implementation specifics like timeout is the first thing we are discussing, but I'm sure there are more such lower level details, right, which are not guided by any RFCs, or IETF documents. So in that case, if we use, we have today backend policy and, service policies under discussion. If we use those resources and somehow like lay out the resources in a way where we have the portability aspects is inside like HTTP route resources, like and gateway resource is sort of portable, but then there might be some specifics in there, right? And then gateway class is something very specific, very implementation specific probably. So if we think about in that pattern, then we can probably put timeout in a play. If like configurations like timeout should be specified in, let's say, backend policy. That's an example, not being prescriptive here, but and then there is an extension point to define timeouts the way you want to define, right? And that gives us enough portability experience where you don't have to dig too deep in all resources when you are porting from one implementation to another.
Yeah, I think that transitions really well to my overarching point here, and I don't want to spend too much more time because there's lots more to get to, but and that is that I was really, I was trying to build out backend policy for this milestone. So looked at timeouts, looked at health checks, and I looked at retries. Of those, retries felt the least portable. I could not find good ways to. I couldn't find a huge number of implementations that support it. It's definitely a concept, but it's not as broadly supported as I thought it would be. Health checks was actually relatively portable, and timeouts, well, we just talked about the portability of timeouts. And this all got me thinking, what are the concepts in backend policy that are truly going to be portable? Because even with health check, not every implementation supports them, and the ones that do support kind of this core set of functionality, but not everything. And so what does that look like for the implementations that support more? Do they create their own policy resource to allow them to specify all the health check config that they want? This is kind of a broad question. I had a branch, I have a branch that I can submit for a PR for health checks, but I kind of wanted to bring this up as a broader discussion here. Is this something like we want to be in the API, or is this something like that we want to have, as part of a service policy concept, a policy concept where implementations bring their own policy? Where do we draw that line between this is a portable concept that should be an API, or this is an implementation specific concept that should be in a policy like resource that implementations can provide?
It might. So one suggestion here is, at the end of the day, it's going to be people using it. So maybe we should just have a doc where we just sketch out, like, let's say someone is attempting to write a portable description for 2 different implementations. Like, what would they check into their GitOps repo, and what would that look like?
Yeah, and I have a spreadsheet and a variety of other things that try to show the portability here, and there are a fair number of portable concepts across implementations for health check, but then you get into things like protocol, some of these thresholds, port that are not necessarily supported, and then you have to ask, well, how would the implementations that support those allow for them to be configured? So
Nginx is missing here, and I think Nginx has no health checks in open source. I'm not sure.
oh no, I thought they had something, but you're right. I should Yeah, let me add Nginx to this list.
I thought the upstream had health checks. Like,
I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
being wrong. So I guess what I'm saying is instead of this table, like we can sort of sketch out, like, let's say no shared object. How would people lay it out? Shared object and then combination of custom stuff.
Yeah.
Because it seems like the custom stuff is going to exist no matter what. Like there's no, I don't know if we can get around that. It's
Yeah.
mostly like the coexistence of them. What would that look like?
Yeah.
It sounds like we're getting to a place where it doesn't make sense. We just need to double check that through an example. I think if we write out the example, then that would probably make the arguments more concrete. Like you could actually point to the fact that one, if you can't do something, it's a clear indication that something's wrong. And then two, you can kind of look at it and see like, how would someone manage it?
Yeah. Yeah, like right now, I think our strongest case for portability at this level is health check, but even that has issues. And if anyone else has ideas of other concepts that might be portable that could attach to policy, I am very interested. But I think that's enough discussion on this. I think I'm going to, I do have that branch, but I'm not sure that health checks belong, like that we should introduce health checks to the API if we're still not sure about it. So I'm going to think about that some more. If anyone feels strongly that we should include it, let me know. I'm happy to make a PR.
Yeah.
So Rob,
I think if
like, I think, you know, we need that example doc. The actual configs and like what we expect users to check into GitHub, you know, git config, and then for like something that's being portably shared.
So to clarify, you're looking for examples of how users might configure a shared common policy resource versus how they might configure vendor-specific policy resources.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, like that's what we're giving the user. And we could, for example, create, you know, we could just make one way, looking at it from our direction, we actually can do either one. But looking at it from the user's direction, it might be more obvious which one makes sense.
All right, I can do a follow-up there. Anyone else have any opinions on this one?
on the health check side, I think if most implementations do support it, and it might be worth experimenting with a feature in the extended conformance space and seeing like how, you know, essentially how the community like reacts to it. Like do people like it, do people not? So it might be worth experimenting. Like we need to experiment a little bit with backend policies, so, like, or some policy early, like right now. Like, otherwise, the whole concept of, you know, portability of, you know, these lower level things goes out, right? And maybe it's only enough to, like, you know, to like the API is vague enough that it allows for extension points in backend policy that are well defined. That's all. Right. So you define timeouts and health checks the way you want, but this is how you should, you know, define them, right? The details and semantics can change, but there is at least, like, when users are moving from one implementation to another, they're not completely surprised, you know.
Yeah, I think like backend policy was almost a design pattern versus an actual thing. Unfortunately, there's like no way except for in just like descript like prose to kind of describe design patterns. Yeah, I do agree. Like it's worth pushing it a little bit just to understand how it will break. And that was kind of aligned with my my statement about let's put together an example doc to like really push it, so we can get some sense of how it breaks.
Yeah, that's fair. There is, if we have time, I'm not sure if we will, there's further discussion around backend policy and really service policy if we get to issue triage. But I think that backend policy is inevitably going to transition to a model like service policy. The question becomes, and I think this is an overarching question with service policy, is if any of the policies that model refers to or includes are actually core resources in the API, or if it's more of a model for attaching custom implementation specific policy resources. But like you're saying, we do need to experiment to some degree with this to get a better understanding of how things actually interact.
Rob, I'll just say one thing. I think the complexity of using both actual custom, like I'll call it, custom service policies, and also extended service policy resources, like one that would be a standard service policy that's used by all implementers. I think there's a lot of complexity in juggling both kinds of resources, and that maybe if they're I just don't know if it's worth it. It feels like it's too much complexity. So that if there is kind of like health check, maybe that just goes into everybody's custom service policy, or maybe that goes into some of the core resources, like route. I'm not sure, but I definitely think that juggling both kinds is going to be a little complex.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was struggling with, right? With health checks, it's portable for, let's say, 5 of the 7 fields implementations might want to support. So for those 2 other fields, what do we do? Do they support them in their custom service policy in addition to their,
you wouldn't want to split your health check config. So the minute you have one additional field within that like configuration block, then it's like, oh, you have to move wholesale to the custom service policy. At which case you basically have to support all the extended fields that exist and the custom ones in every service policy.
Yeah.
That's okay, exactly, and that's kind of what I'm asking for the example, is if we can lay out that example. It's like very obvious, Mark, what you were saying is it might some choices are very awkward in the example.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll follow up with that and link it to an issue and in Slack. All right, let's start moving on the milestone, because that is really what we need to get in. Harry's done some awesome work on the admission webhook server. I tested it out myself and it worked perfectly, first try for me at least. I know this is also building on Chris's work from before. Thanks for picking this up. I think, Harry, you had a couple follow-up questions as far as what our next steps were here.
Yeah, so yesterday I spent a bunch of time looking at how like you actually do, like we have some code and now we need to build and push it to like a Docker registry. So I've gone through a bunch of hoops and there is some work to do there, and we need to rely on external, like that PR that you just linked in the comment, we need to get that merged in. And then we need to ping some folks to create Google groups and repos and things like that. So there's that side of work. What I was hoping was if somebody else can also review this, and if we can sort of get this pull request merged in so that it is in the code, and if we we are making any code changes, this is part of the mainline trunk, and then getting actual build out requires us to add a couple of files to the repo. It requires an additional prow job, and then it requires setting up, like renaming our service APIs to gateway APIs repo. So that's like the amount of work that's left here. What I would really like is if we can get this in first and use an iterative approach to actually building and publishing the webhook image. How do folks feel about that?
Yeah, I think you're right that this is kind of a chicken and egg problem where we can't solve this entirely without getting some part of this in first. It feels like we do need at least the webhook code in before we do anything beyond that. One concern I have, like one of your suggestions was to add a to-do here instead of using that. I think that's reasonable. I'm wondering if, in addition to that, we also need some kind of comments or something to make it clear that although this YAML exists, it's not quite ready for use. Just to clarify that we have a webhook, it's checked in, but it's still very much work in progress. But it does seem like, if I'm understanding the other bits of the process correctly, we need this code checked in to actually enable things like image building and everything else.
Yeah, we need this, and then there's another cloudbuild.yaml file that we need to check into main, and then test, then Proud does its thing, and then fix things if things don't work as they should. But I mean, we can add cloudbuild.yaml to this PR. It requires some other changes in the code base, and then merge that, or we can merge this and then okay, we want to update the make file, and sort of all the other plumbing around it, and that can be a separate PR.
I think smaller PRs are generally better. This is already pretty large in scope. So I think it's good to just try and get this one in. If we can get one more review, at least one more reviewer on this, that would be helpful. But otherwise, I think it's about ready to go.
I have it up. I'll go ahead and do a review on it.
Awesome,
Thanks,
thanks.
Daniel.
Great. Was there anything else on this one?
I don't think so.
Cool. All right, Steve, you've got you ended up creating this PR, which is for Gateway Listener, and in the last meeting we labeled this as critical urgent, as something that we really wanted to get in. I think this is awfully close. There was just some confusion around naming here. Lots of discussion around naming. My latest suggestion here, I'm interested in feedback on, would be like, there was confusion if we called this backend ref or if we called this forward to, because those already have existing meaning in the API elsewhere. And since this feels more like a shortcut, a route shortcut, I was curious if we could use route to. So it's kind of clear that it's replacing the route component and just directly routing to a service name and port. Any feedback on this concept?
I'll take a detailed look.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm
Same
not
here.
sure. I know I did the PR, but I guess
Yeah.
we needed to chat about it. Why I didn't want to do any more until we sort of kind of landed on some sort of agreement on how to handle it in a way,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that could work. I don't know. Sometimes route, I think of like L7 route, but maybe that's just my history with Contour, and that's what I think of first.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it makes sense only because like what we want to do is basically it's a route shortcut, right? And in all the three cases we talked about using this, whether it's for doing a route shortcut for a TCP to skip over a TCP route or to skip over an HTTP route, all cases are route shortcuts. So I think using a new name like that does make sense. It does give us the flexibility to change, to have it be different than forward to as well. So yeah.
So something that comes to mind with this shortcut is without the shortcut, we kind of have this bi-directional, binding. So it's like a service owner could say, even though a gateway exists, right, I want to make sure that My route doesn't automatically bind to the gateway. I mean, how do we support that same concept with this shortcut? And if we don't support it, is that a concern?
Yeah, is this only going to be within the same namespace? Because as soon as you get cross namespace, we have to do something.
Yeah, this is currently scoped to same namespace only. But I agree with the point Danian made, but I think there's a little bit of nuance there in that right now the two-way handshake we have is between gateway and route. What we don't have is a two-way handshake between route and service, but we probably do need that if the route service relationship ever ends up crossing a namespace boundary. And I think if we did that, and I don't know if we should, but if we did, that should be solved the same way as it is here. But right now, both of these, whether it's a route to service relationship or a gateway to service relationship, are same namespace.
And I think it's valid to, if it's going to cross namespaces, then you need to do the more complicated thing. I think that's like, that feels appropriate.
I agree with Rob. Like today a routes can't be cross namespace. I mean, it can't reference a service in another namespace. So neither should this. But I do think that we should make the routes cross namespace, in which case this would also be cross namespace, but we don't necessarily need to mix them.
Right, and we've already, we've already been very clear. This is a shortcut. This is not going to have the full functionality of route. It's not going to have traffic splitting or anything else. This is really just a shorthand for a route. And keeping the scope tiny is very important, I think. So I'm fine if we really leave it as service name and port. I think this is really meant to make L4 specifically more practical, though it also has other helpful use cases.
Yeah, I think I agree with like keeping this as simple as possible and like using other more complicated features to achieve anything more. Because if you actually look at it, you can do TCP and UDP like pass through using this, but you can also do like if you want to do TLS terminations and then do a TCP byte stream, you can also do all that, and you can do some complicated stuff as well using this.
Yeah, that's a good point. There was, go ahead, Daniel, sorry.
I was just going to ask, I haven't had a chance to look at this. A quick question would be, is if this shortcut's meant for layer 4, is the spec updated with this PR that specifies like the kind must be UDP route or TCP route?
I don't think so. I think this is most helpful with L4, but I don't think we need to limit it to L4. Okay. That's my own perspective, but interested if anyone thinks differently.
So if it's not limited to TCP and UDP route, then it, again, kind of going back to that binding, then it could be a way to kind of circumvent the binding as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess what this makes possible is it allows, in our security model so far, we've assumed that a gateway owner can also read and write resources below it. That may not always be true. So if you have a case where gateway and route owner are two separate roles and gateway owners have no control over routes, then we're adding capabilities to the gateway owner that they wouldn't already have. That's a good point. I don't know how common that use case is, but it's worth calling out.
Could it also go the other way around, where with gateway merging allowed, route owners can create gateways to use this feature?
Wait, explain that again. How would gateway merging come into this?
So now one can define like routing inside the gateway itself, right? So if somebody could figure out an RBAC policy where the route owners have right access to gateway resource, and then the gateway resource, like there is a business use case where each TCP port gets forwarded to an application, right? So then the owner of that service creates a gateway with that TCP port forwarding to the service of that team, and then another team comes in and creates a gateway resource, and then all of those that get combined and are configured, and that configuration is pushed to a proxy or load balancer. So, but that is, I think that goes against our sort of security model. Like, you shouldn't do that.
Interesting.
Thinking out loud.
Oh. Okay, well, maybe this PR does need a bit more discussion. It's funny. I know when we initially had the issue, it seemed like it was a fairly straightforward idea. But yeah, as we've dug into it further, maybe there are areas where we need more discussion.
I think if we keep this simple, we don't need much discussion. If we just keep like, you cannot just say same namespace, just forward to the service, I think then it becomes the simplistic case is okay.
Yeah.
If we think about all of these more complicated problems, otherwise we cannot do the simple use case, right? Shortcut is for simplicity.
Yeah, I think the intention was to basically model to make this more comparable to the service load balancer type.
Yeah.
And which is in the same namespace, and kind of the same security model, because if you can create a service, then you can expose it. But it implies that the service owner also owns the gateway. Like at least my assumption was that in this case, yeah, the service owner would be creating the gateway as well. I know there's no way with Kubernetes RBAC, at least I think, to specify what kind of gateways you can create, like depending on the gateway class. But ultimately, for there to be like, the ability to create layer 4 gateways, but not layer 7 gateways, would require something like Gatekeeper, I think, to actually pull that off.
We provided some sample policies, or a sample policy that would implement that. But you're right. It's hard for me to think of a use case where someone would have access to create gateways in a namespace, but not services. It feels like gateway is such an elevated resource in terms of control. But
within the same namespace, that just feels very odd. Usually namespaces are handed over wholesale.
Right.
Unless you're some kind of horizontal control, in which case, that just feels weird.
What about users who have access to create service resource, but don't have access to create gateway resources? That is okay as per our security model.
Yeah.
That's what we want, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's fine. I think it's reasonably safe, at least from my understanding, to assume that a gateway owner has control over services in the namespace it has control over gateways in, or at least is trusted enough that, you assume someone with control of gateways in a namespace is highly trusted.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's any, maybe if there's any opposition to this or additional feedback, add it to this PR soon. But otherwise, I would like to get it in. I think this is you know, based on what we've been going for this milestone, we really do want to get these kinds of helpful features in. And, you know, we still have the ability to break things, but right now I think this is a, you know, requested feature that would be helpful. And I would lean towards getting it in myself, at least. Okay. Well, I will move on from that. I know we've got a few other things. I made a PR that is intended to provide better support for namespace scoped implementations. There's been, I think, yeah, I was going back and forth with James on this for a bit more context. But this actually came from discussions we were having here, but also in the ingress, well, in upstream for ingress, where there's some frustration about the need for a gateway class resource or an ingress class resource in that case, because it really makes it difficult or impossible to deploy a controller within the scope of a namespace if you don't have cluster scoped access. And so this tried to provide a relatively simple model, one that was discussed in upstream and here to basically allow for the namespace scoped implementations by making gateway class name slightly more meaningful, or leaving the option open for it to refer to a class that does not have a corresponding resource. I think this is a concept we've discussed before, but this is actually turning it into a real implementation. Any strong feelings on this one? Cool. Well, I know we've got more to go through, but if someone has time, please take a look and review that one. Okay, so adding a controller, I think this is one of the most straightforward ones. This came from an issue earlier. I think John had filed this, that it could be confusing to clean up status, route status, if you didn't know as a controller that you previously owned a gateway. And so the solution that we came to in that issue was to add controller to status, to the gateway reference in status, so that you can clearly find all gateways that you as a controller added to status for a route, and therefore can remove them if you no longer have you know, any understanding that or any reference or you're not managing a gateway named this in this namespace anymore. So primarily for cleanup, but also likely adds a bit of useful information to users as well. This feels very straightforward to me, but just if anyone has time to review it, it looks like it has an LGTM already. All right. Another tiny one.
Wait, Rob, it looks like it's already approved. Oh, that's because you already have to approve it. But so it didn't get a real LGTM. Why don't we just put a real LGTM and go in?
Yeah,
that.
I'm not cool enough to do that yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think this looks good to me. It's just as long as we preface them that they have the right.
Yeah.
You know, if you call your controller, then everyone could call it that, and then it's not helpful anymore.
That's a good point, and I probably should clarify this, but I was assuming that this, you know, the gateway class dot controller has a very clear connotation as far as what the controller name should be, but I should make the connection a little bit more clear.
Yeah, Rob, can we have an example, and then everyone follows the example as a template?
Sure. Okay, I'll do that.
I think and then it can merge in.
Yeah, that works. One more tiny follow-up here. This is a PR based on some feedback that we did not have clear guidance if there was a conflict within a route, and you know, you had basically an equivalent rule within a route. This adds that. This is again based on an issue, and I think we have relative consensus on this one, so hopefully not too controversial. And the last one, this one was just to follow up. Harry, you've been doing a lot here. I know you'd volunteered to take this one on. This is really just following up from a Slack conversation and making sure we don't lose it and document it somewhere. But if you don't feel like you have time to take this on, we can try and find someone else for it too. I just want to make sure we can get it in.
Yeah, I mean, the admission webhook turned out to be much bigger than I had hoped for. So,
Yeah.
if anybody else has the bandwidth to take this up, would be really helpful. Otherwise, yeah.
Let me look at the Slack there. Maybe I can help out here with this one.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sounds good. Okay, that's all I had, and I think we don't have enough time to get into back-end policy discussion, but I do want to highlight it for anyone who's interested in all the policy conversation going on. I thought there were really good updates and discussion here with John and Mark on both that issue, that's 583, and 611, which is the service policy issue. And great conversation in both cases. So if you want to continue the conversation, I think both of these updates are great. But I don't think we have enough time to cover them today. So yeah, I've got to run, but thank you everyone. We'll look forward to, I think we're reasonably on track to get a milestone out in 8 days. So it's been great. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk in Slack or on GitHub.